Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second day of AKLF 2021. We have a brilliant day planned ahead for you, and we start off with a very interesting session right now, which is revisiting Madhusudan Dutt. We have with us noted writer and the most well-known director of JLF, Ms. Namita Gokhale, along with noted academic Malashri Lal. With them in conversation will be best-selling author and critically acclaimed Kunal Basu. I will not take much of their time, so I will just hand over the proceedings to Mr. Basu.
Hello, and welcome to our session on Betrayed by Hope, revisiting Michael Madhusudan Dutt. Welcome to our two speakers, Namita Gokhale and Malashri Lal, who are the authors of this remarkable book. You know, when friends come to visit us in Kolkata from out of town, say from out of India or from other parts of India, I usually take them out to see the sights of the city. And I always start by going to two cemeteries. To the South Park Street Cemetery to visit the grave of Henry Louis Vivian Desrosiers, and then a few hundred yards away to the Circular Road Cemetery to see the grave of Michael Madhusudan Dutt. And when friends ask, why two cemeteries? I always say, because here lie two great sons of Kolkata, okay? Known for immense talent, for being iconoclastic, going against the grain, for being somewhat erratic in personal life, more Michael than Desrosiers, and for leaving a legacy which most Bengalis and indeed Indians are proud of. So I was really delighted to have a copy of your book, Namita and Malashri, Betrayed by Hope. And I have to start by asking the two of you, why Michael? How did you come upon him?
Do you want me to begin?
Sure.
You know, I was so amused and also touched when you described Michael Madhusudan Dutt as erratic and against the grain, because I think many people might well describe me as being erratic and against the grain. And I can't speak Bangla. I don't know Calcutta well. I feel this deep imposter syndrome at having begun on this task. But why it began for me was that on the 25th of January is the birthday of Michael Madhusudan Dutt. My birthday is on the cusp of the 25th and the 26th. Dare I say it, I used to drink a lot of cognac, and I saw the photograph of him with the balloon glass in his hand, and he was a genius and an unrecognized genius to some sense. I mean, he was recognized as a cult figure, but his deep contribution to, as you said, the literary canvas of India is not often acknowledged. So I felt this need, this desire to write about him after doing a review of Ghulam Murshid's famous book,
Yes.
Heart of a Rebel Poet, which showed his letters, and also Lured by Hope, the biography. But more than anything, it was the letters that brought the man and his times alive for me. And I started marking them with a pink marker into 5 acts. And this was in 2004. I had this intense conviction that I would write a play someday. And then when my old friend, collaborator, co-author, partner, Dr. Malashri Lal entered the picture, it got the reality of discipline of a rigorous mind as well, and imaginations often work together. So this play came to be. Now, Mala, what do you think? Is that an accurate description of how it happened for me?
It is accurate. And in a way, Kunal, I take off from what you're saying, then when people from outside of Bengal get to Calcutta, not too many of them know about Michael Madhusudan Dutt. And I grew up in a Bengali family, but in Rajasthan, went to Calcutta very regularly and had a grandmother who trained me in Bangla language, literature, poetry, etc. So I knew something of Michael Madhusudan Dutt, but not too much. And then I realized that this was true of many of my friends who were not associated with Bengal. Then Namita and I started our work on Sita way back in 2006 or so. And then while working on the Ramayana, there were questions about alternate discourses that came to my mind. And sure enough, Michael Madhusudan Dutt and Meghnad Bodh Kabbo, which all Bengalis know, came to me again and again. And then by sheer coincidence, Namita and I were having our usual cups of coffee, no cognac for me. And we got talking about the possibility of working on Michael Madhusudan Dutt as another version of the Ramayana. And then the letters. I didn't know the letters. Namita really led me to those. And I found them so profound, so self reflective, so examining and analyzing of the times in which he was writing, an utterly charming, passionate, infuriating poet. But there he was, a great talent. And that's how the book began for me.
No, that's wonderful. You're very accurate when you say that while Michael is household name in Bengal, it is not necessarily the case in the rest of the country, let alone the rest of the world. And therefore, this book is a great contribution, it's a wonderful contribution. What really piqued my curiosity was that you chose a somewhat novel format to write this book, okay? Rather than a straight biography, which you could have written, you wrote a play, which would have certainly warmed Michael's heart because he wrote many plays. How did that come about? Why did you think of doing a play?
Should I begin, Mala, or would you like to take off from there?
Well, I can take it up. See, Namita's novels, which of course I read with great care, have a lot of very lively dialogue. So it is a kind of a natural expression of her creativity. In my case, I was very enchanted by the fact that Michael's confusions, his dilemmas, the paradoxes with which he was living were very contemporary and were not entirely locked in his time. Now, how are we going to meet this dialogic question of relating Michael's context, his voice through his letters to our time? And the only way that could have been done was through the medium of a play script.
No, I think it's wonderful because precisely for the reason that you mentioned, a lot has been written about Michael. A lot of historiography has gone into unearthing his life. And as Namita mentioned, Ghulam Murshid's book is an amazing compendium of all the research. His original book in Bengali, which is called Ashad Cholone Bhuli. But in order to make Michael accessible to today's readers, to today's realities, I thought the play, conceiving the book as a play was a masterstroke.
So now, there's another point there, if I could come out about conceiving it as a play, is that when I began, for me, it was also important, as I said, from this imposter syndrome, to access him through his own voice. And then the play would be valid because I wouldn't be presuming, except in the modern tense, to impose my views, my voice, except in a short passage into what was an area I didn't know so well. And there was this young man called Arun Das. He was young then when we began so many years ago. And he and I sat down and marked out these pink passages, as I said, and he read them. He did some readings in public places, and they went down very well. And in fact, today at the end of the session, we will ask the Oxford Bookstore people to play some short excerpt from his readings of the thing. And towards the end, Kunal, I'd love to tell you a story that links up Arun Das, drama, theatre, the supernatural, and the grave that you talked about in the very beginning. But we'll save it for the end. Sorry, please continue.
Very good. Look, the word contradiction has popped up a number of times already in our conversation, and it has certainly popped up in the 2 forewords that you've written to the play, both Malashri and yourself. So let's talk a little bit about his contradictions. I mean, he was conflicted in many different ways, wasn't he? In terms of the religion that he adopted, Christianity, in terms of the language that he chose to write in his early years, in terms of sort of wrenching himself free from Kolkata and going away to Madras. Okay, so there were self-inflicted alienations that he brought about. Did they influence his poetry in your judgment? Was there a subconscious plan to that? Was it simply an extension of the erratic nature, the wanderlust that he preserved in his mind?
He was a passionate and restless soul, don't you think, Namita? And he started writing in English almost as a spillover from the colonial education that he received. And he turned to Christianity to get out of an orthodox planned marriage.
That's right.
So there were many factors that were pulling him in different directions from the very beginning. But the English writing didn't get much of a support. And then there's a famous letter from Bethune, which tells Michael Madhusudan Dutt to a friend that it's better to give up writing in this mode and turn to your own language. And it must have been extremely hurtful for Michael to get this information and get this kind of a feedback on his writing. It was a captive lady that they were responding to. But he heeded that advice in a way and taught himself to write in Bangla.
It's very curious that the very same experience happened to Derozio. So Derozio, who wrote poetry in English, when he sent them off to magazines and journals in England, they would come back with sort of very condescending and say, well, some of it might be good, but you're advised to write in your tongue. It's not good enough to be published in England. And so the literary elite of England and in India rejected him, which turned out to be a great benefit and a great boon for Bengali literature, certainly. Okay. This fascination with English, there's several letters that you have, several wonderful letters that you have in your play, when he writes to his friend Gourdash Boshak, and he says that, my writing may smell of a foreign air, okay, but so be it. Why shouldn't it? Okay, and things like that. But then also he makes a migration back. And this journey, this linguistic journey in itself, in many ways, is so fascinating about the life and works of Michael, isn't it? Would you want to say something about that? How did you see, all of us have written in English. A lot of contemporary Indian writers write in English, not all of them, but many of them. And yet for Michael, it was a journey that started with the foreign tongue, but came back with the mother tongue, to the mother tongue.
I think a lot of this has to do with the nature of the English language itself and the insidious way in which it colonized the literary imagination of the whole world, really. And this dilemma, this contradiction, this double-forked tongue could be found perhaps in Africa. I've had African writers talking about it, and in not so much in some parts of Asia, but in all the colonized world, there have been tongues and languages which have been silenced by English. But contradictor that he was, it did not, in Michael Madhusudan Dutt's case, silence his Bangla, or silence his Urdu, or silence his Farsi. It enriched all the Indian languages by taking it and bringing its forms and its meters and its knowledge and its learning and its sensibility, and owning and appropriating it. And that, in fact, was the contradiction of his whole life, that he sought a larger mosaic, a larger canvas than his limited world could contain. And to reach out to that larger world, he had to make some jumps that looked like breaks in his life. But actually, he was weaving a larger picture together for all of them. And I think that is why I was drawn to him as this great unrecognized literary figure who the word catalyst assumes it's only a chemical reaction, but who was much more than a catalyst, much more than an enabler. It was somebody whose literary imagination could dare pick up anything in the world and use it. And in that sense, I think he was a true cosmopolitan, and yet at the same time, deeply, deeply rooted in his language and his own reality,
Yeah.
deny it as he might.
Uh,
I don't know.
I couldn't agree with you more. And this is a theme that comes through in your rendition of the play as well, Malashri and Namita. Reading Michael seemed like that he was a person who was, in many ways, he was perhaps certainly the first, but maybe the only, with the exception of Tagore, cosmopolitan poet in India. Okay, who drew from different sources and made them his own, truly his own. Um, and is that his legacy? Is that something, there is some confusion, some questioning about what has Michael left behind? Because sometimes his life, which is incredibly colorful and overshadows his writing. We, growing up in Kolkata, we have all read Michael Madhusudan's writings in school. Also, Choturdoshpadi Kovitabuli, his poetry, which was a part of the school curriculum. Okay, but if you ask most Bengalis today, he's more of a cultural icon than really a person whose work, whose the substance of his work is under appreciation. So, is that the legacy Michael leaves behind? That in order to reflect your time, in order to reflect your land, you have to step outside of it and somehow have to return to it?
That's a very thoughtful query, Kunal. I don't know about his being the only cosmopolitan other than Tagore, because there were people like Vivekananda who also straddled many worlds. But yes, he was not a literature of the same stature as Michael and Tagore. His fascination with the English literary tradition is something we need to think about closely. And as a professor of English, I've had to deal with this for a very, very long time. Milton, for instance, he gained a lot from Paradise Lost and was fascinated by the character of Satan. And some of Meghnad Bodh, of course, borrows from there. Byron, again, a rebel figure, romantic in his own way, a traveler, a person who gained from many cultures, a man with a cosmopolitan sensibility. Again, Michael gained a lot from Byron. And therefore, his interest in the variety of literature that came out of Europe and England, Michael's fascination with learning various languages. He wrote sonnets, he wrote epics, he wrote all kinds of lyrical poetry. He was an experimenter. And that experiment was only possible because he had this cosmopolitan mindset and a linguistic reach into the legacies of many languages in Europe.
There's a very, very interesting point that you make in your book, where it comes out through Michael's letters when he says, if I were ever to return to Europe, this was from Versailles, and he writes to Gordash Boshak and says, if I ever were to return to Europe, I think I would be able to write something of value in French, which also in some ways indicates the level of confidence. And perhaps you could speak a bit about this. The personality of Michael that emerges so well in this book is that he was a person who was never short of self-confidence. He was, and it almost bordered on arrogance, and he almost had to say, "Oh my God, this is he." He really thinks much about himself, but this was a part of his persona, wasn't it?
I think the question of being betrayed by hope, which we brought into the title, I think being betrayed by hope also came as being betrayed by an overconfidence and an over optimism in everything. But at the same time, I am reasonably convinced that had he lived, as he said, in Europe longer, he would have brought up something of deep substance and aerated it with his own, given it the cross ventilation of being born in Calcutta and imbibing European traditions through that prism. In fact, one of the early titles for the play that I had thought of, but which Mala and I then worked against, was Byron in Calcutta. Because it really, he would have given it in so many directions, enriched and enlivened the European tradition had the privilege of having him look into it.
One of the limitations in what would appear to be a legacy for Michael is that people don't read enough of Michael Madhusudan Dutt. Maybe the expanse and range of his writing is not available in accessible translation, but works like Atto Bilap, even Bongo Bhasha, Amit Chaudhary's done a translation for our book. And his plays like Krishna Kumari, which is about Rajasthan and influenced by Todd, these are not readily available in translation. So people don't know enough about Michael's literary production to align it with his cosmopolitan sensibility and his legacy. The direct legacy, of course, is to Tagore, who didn't think very highly of Michael Madhusudan Dutt in the beginning, in fact, thought the poetry was rather contrived. But Tagore later changed his mind and had good things to say about Michael.
Absolutely. You know, there's...
I'd like to interrupt here, Kunal. I'd like to ask you what you think the legacy is, because I suspect you have perhaps more formulated views than at least I do. And I want to know what you think is the legacy.
You know, the literary legacy of Michael, you've both written about, so I'm not going to venture into that domain. In terms of his contribution of form, which is his cosmopolitanism was flexible enough in order to accommodate different traditions of poetry and bring them to Bengali poetry, blank verse, and so on and so forth. You've done that well. I'm drawn to Michael because in some sense, he represents the idealized Bengali persona of a creative person. And who is that creative person? A person who is immensely talented, of course, and I'm building an archetype, as you can see, who doesn't really care about the small details of life, the niceties of life. And this small piece that I'm going to read that you've written, Namita, actually exemplifies that. And he's a person who is willing to, go against the grain, incredibly iconoclastic, and has a kind of confidence bordering on arrogance, saying that, this is who I am, this is what I've written, take it or leave it. Okay, that is the legacy which I would like more authors, more poets, more playwrights to have in some sense, whereas more and more Bengali authors and practitioners of literature today are far too strategic, in my view, are far too tame in their approach to their own contribution and the worth of their own work, which Michael never had any questions about. So the legacy is in many ways I will give you an example. Utpal Datta, the famous thespian, okay, who also started with English. Okay, he's known for his writing on Shakespeare and for staging Shakespearean plays. Made a return to Bangla theatre, and I distinctly remember him playing the role of Michael in this play called Darao Pothik Por. And what an amazing Michael he was. Mala, there's another thing that I would like to bring forth in terms of not a lot of his work is read and appreciated, but even in Bengal, people don't realize that he had written all these classic plays which are based on myths and certainly the Ramayana and others, Todd's Rajasthan, but also he had written two deeply satirical plays called Ekei Ki Bole Shobhota, Is This What You Call Civilization? And Budo Shaliker Ghare Ro, which criticized the Brahmanical order of the villages of Bengal. And they were written in a language which was the language of the peasantry, the language of the streets, not the language of the court, not the language of the classical language. Utpal Datta also staged Budo Shaliker Ghare Ro to great aplomb. So I think the legacy of in many ways Michael is to go beyond one's realm and to step beyond one's realm with confidence. And to the extent that would survive in Bengal would bode well for the literary culture of this place. I do have another question to both of you, which is we know that Michael was sort of appreciated at home, not appreciated abroad. Okay, you have written, and which is absolutely accurate, that when he died and there was this kerfuffle about, about his burial and things like that, in the end, 1,000 people accompanied him to the Lower Circular Road Cemetery. Now, 1,000 people in 1873 going out to a cemetery for a poet and a playwright was something, wasn't it? Okay, but Michael seemed himself to have moved a bit away from poetry in his later years, especially after he came back from England. Is that your understanding as well?
Michael tended to experiment with different forms and different types of writing throughout his life. And yes, towards the end, he seemed somewhat dispirited, even in his letters. And he wrote Hector Bod and he wrote Maya Kanon. So one in an epical mode, one in a pastoral mode. But the adoration of Michael as a writer and that moment when he died and the burial was a bit of a problem, those are very moving episodes. But what we tried to do in the play is to jump from that time frame to ours, which is why I'd like Namita also to talk about the Sutradhar that we brought into the play, the Bangladeshi researcher who takes on the subject of Michael Madhusudan Dutt. The legacy of Michael is also the split identity among many of us who are emigrating from one situation to another and constantly juggling our contexts. And that dilemma in Michael's time and in ours remains persistent. And that is perhaps also what our play is trying to push for, the realization that we all are split personalities.
It's very well put. It's very well put. Would you like me to read a little bit from the book at this point?
Yes, please.
Yeah. There are some wonderful letters that Michael had written that you have in your volume, but I wanted to read a part that you have written. Okay. And there, near the end of the book, there is this piece that really moved me a lot. So with your permission, I'm going to read a little bit from that. Okay. This is, for the sake of our audience, this is written by our authors. This is not Michael's writing, but it's in Michael's voice. So this is Michael speaking. Barrister Michael Madhusudan Dutt, who gets no cases and is spurned by the courts. My patient Henrietta and Albert Napoleon and Frederick Michael Milton starve in Versailles, even as I speak. Yes, I am husband to Henrietta and father to these two hapless souls. No, I am none of these. I'm the creator of Meghnad, of Sarmista, of Padmavati. I may have forgotten the names of my children, but I remember all of whom that I've written to life. They're alive in my mind and will remain so in the hearts of those who will read on after me, after I'm gone, after my children's children are gone, and their children too. Yes, the world will remember King Porus. It will remember the captive lady, Sarmista and Padmavati. Krishna Kumari will live on, and so will Tilottama. Meghnad will straddle the stage of the world, as will Rizia, Empress of Ind. My sonnets, my poems, they will speak for me. Immortality. I have immortality. Words and literature are my life. And the rest of it, this mess of living and loving, continued but as the excess baggage. A poet has the right to selfishness. And for the poetic genius must illuminate itself before it can share its light with others. In his way, my beloved father understood this and continued to love me against the tide of my actions. My friend Vidlashavu, he understands the demands of a heart and a mind such as mine. I spoke my first words in Bangla, and in my epitaph, I shall return to my own tongue, my sacred mother tongue. How wonderfully you've written. So many congratulations for Betrayed by Hope. I hope your book will resurrect Michael to those who are uninitiated to this great poet and playwright. And to those who are outside of Bengal, who are outside of India, they will get a taste of what Michael Madhusudan Dutta was all about. Thank you. Thank you, Namita. Thank you, Malashri.
Thank you very much, Kunal. Thank you, Namita.
Growing up Bengali, apart from the default familiarity with his name and I suppose the sound of Meghnad Bad Kabbo, I didn't really know Michael until Namita called me over one evening, way back in 2006, I think, to read his letters with her. Since then, Michael has been a recurring theme in our shared lives, with a kind of calling to make something of this richly intimate material on this giant who had a rather rough time, particularly in the latter part of his life, even as he continued to impact so dramatically the future of Bengali expression. I was delighted, therefore, when Namita and Maladi strung it all together in the form of a script for the stage, which then presented Inji and I the perfect excuse to indulge ourselves in exploring our own mixed up Bengali identities. I am a Probashi, born and raised in Delhi, and Inji Zaba Zahir, who reads the play with me in our digital presentation, is originally from Bangladesh and currently living in Vancouver, Canada. As friends, we realized quite early that the reason we were bonding and reconnecting so furiously over Michael's journey of alienation and return to self was perhaps because we are essentially Bengali in disparate parts of the world outside of Bengal, carrying through our dotted lives something of a shared legacy. It's been a deeply revealing trip. So thank you, Namita. Thank you, Maladi, and thank you all for finding our reading of this play across time zones worthy of your attentions here.
Home at last. After a month at sea, Madhusudan arrived in Calcutta on 2nd February 1856. The great romantic had returned to the city of his youth, expecting to inherit a vast estate. Remember, he was a creature of hope. MMD had believed that his relatives who conspired to seize the estates would withdraw their claims as soon as they saw him, and he would take sole possession of all property. What he found instead were litigious relations with a stranglehold on the legal system.
On inquiry, he realized that his father had left a lot more property than he had originally anticipated.
And he expected to be feted by the literati of Calcutta as the new Kobi, the new poet. After all, the city was abuzz with cultural activities. The creative frenzy saw some of the great works in Bangla literature come to life. Even the local theaters showed a vigorous interest in Shakespeare and adapted his plays for the Bangla audience.
Bhanumati Chitta Bilash, an adaptation of The Merchant of Venice, and Bhranti Bilash, an adaptation of The Comedy of Errors, were particularly popular.
But the literary community was quite indifferent to Michael's imaginings. And for the first 2.5 years in Calcutta, it seems he did not have much creative output as he had enjoyed in Madras. But then Dutt chanced upon an unexpected opportunity. The princely Singha brothers commissioned playwright Ramnarayan Tarak Ratna to write a Bangla play based on the Sanskrit work Ratnaboli. This play was performed on their private stage in July 1858. And since English guests at the performance included the Governor General of Bengal, they wished to have a play translated into English. Our MMD was given the job. This was the beginning of the young aspirant's renewed literary career in Bengal. He soon wrote his first major work in Bangla, a play based on the mythological story of King Yayati, Queen Devyani, and the maid who is actually a cursed princess, Shormishta. It was a fast-paced drama about subterfuge and betrayal and proved to be a major success.
Calcutta, 9th January 1859. My dear Gaur, Shormishta has turned out to be a most delightful girl, if I am to believe those who have already inspected her. Jyotindra says it is the best drama in the language, chaste, classical, and full of genuine poetry. The Choto Raja writes in raptures about it and swears the drama is a complete success. But I dare say you have heard their opinions before this. There is to be an English translation. I hope to send you copies, English and Bengali, when they are ready, and you shall have an opportunity of judging for yourself.
Meanwhile, the Bengal reform movement, in which many of Madhusudan's friends were participants, had brought out social as well as literary activism. Ishwar Chandra Bidyasagar was foremost in leading the arguments against child marriage, and he was an advocate for the remarriage of child widows. As old practices crumbled with the passing of the Hindu Widows Remarriage Act in 1856, Bengal saw turmoil and unrest.
Dutt, meanwhile, wrote critical pieces in the Hindu Chronicle and the Spectator in support of the progressive environment.
His friend, Rajnarayan Basu, was trying to support widow remarriages. Other friends worked towards the prevention of polygamy, another bane of 19th century convention in Bengal. Hardly had the dust settled on these reforms when the Sepoy Mutiny broke out in 1857, again creating political and social upheavals. Bengali intelligentsia, many among whom held Western civilization in high esteem, had to now acknowledge the exploitative nature of colonialism and rethink the meaning of nationalism.
Dinabandhu Mitra wrote his famous play Neel Darpan, The Indigo Planting Mirror, in 1860, about the plight of the indigo farmers.
Madhusudan's creativity was stirred by the intellectual ferment in the aftermath of 1857. As much as he admired English literature and culture, he recognized the coercive practices of the British administration. This period saw an outburst of creativity in Akobi, who was ready to defy all manner of conservatism.